The street is empty. It is still hours before dawn, and the market town of Wickham rests in deep, unhurried quiet. The only light comes from a single tallow candle balanced on a windowsill, its small flame pulling gently against a draught that finds its way through the old timber frame of the bakehouse wall. In the houses above the street, families sleep tucked under wool blankets, dogs curl by dying hearths, and the whole town breathes slowly in the dark. But in the narrow building wedged between the dyer's shop and the cooper's yard, the building with the low door and the permanent drift of ash around its step, there is already movement. There is already warmth. Thomas the baker has been awake since the church bell marked 2 o'clock in the morning. He rose in the dark, as he always does, pulling his rough linen tunic over his head by feel alone, his hands already rehearsing in the dark the work they have done 10,000 times before. His wife, Agnes, slept on. His youngest daughter stirred briefly and was still again. The cat, a large grey animal who has claimed the warmest corner of the bakehouse as his own private territory, opened one yellow eye and closed it.
There was no ceremony to the waking. There never is. The bakers of medieval England did not rise to alarms or appointments. They rose because the bread had to be ready. Absolutely had to be ready when the town came alive. And the town came alive at dawn. This meant Thomas had to begin his day when the town was deepest in its sleep. He did not resent this. Or, if he did, he had long since made his peace with the resentment, folded it away somewhere, behind the flour bins, and forgotten about it. A baker's relationship with darkness is different from most men's. Where a farmer might dread rising before light, Thomas had learned to feel a quiet ownership of those still hours. They belonged to him. The town was his in those hours. The street was his. The silence was his to move through, unhurried, unbothered, carrying his candle from room to room, like a man inspecting something valuable. He begins, as he always begins, with the oven. The bakehouse oven is the true center of everything. Not just the building, but the life. It is enormous by any standard. A stone and clay structure built into the back wall so thoroughly that it has become the wall. Its arched mouth wide enough that Thomas could, and sometimes does, climb partway inside to reach the back with a long-handled peel. It was here when Thomas arrived as an apprentice 30 years ago. It was here when the old master baker, Robert, died of a winter fever and left Thomas the shop, the tools, the debts, and the knowledge. It has outlasted everyone who has fed it. The oven holds heat the way old stone holds memory. Fed properly the night before, with a good load of faggots, bundles of dry brushwood and offcuts from the carpenter 2 streets away, it will wake in the morning not cold, but merely sleeping. Thomas's first task of every morning is to open the oven door and read its temperature the way a navigator reads the sky. by instinct, by smell, by the particular orange-gold colour of the embers still glowing at its base. He does this now. He crouches before the oven mouth, feeling the warmth press against his face, and studies the colour of the coals. They are good, deep and steady.
Thomas crouched before the fire, the bakehouse dark except for the orange light of the oven mouth, to understand just how central the baker and his oven were to the medieval town. In the year 1280, most English households had no oven of their own. The oven that could produce a proper loaf, the tall, domed clay and stone structure that Thomas now tends, required enormous amounts of fuel to heat, enormous amounts of skill to manage, and enormous amounts of space to house safely. In a timber-framed town, where fire was the ever-present catastrophe, where houses stood shoulder to shoulder and a single spark could devour a street in an hour, Thomas has added the last of his morning wood and now straightens up, pressing one hand to the small of his back. He is not a young man. His hands are remarkable things, wide and heavy, dusted permanently with a pale residue that no amount of washing entirely removes. The knuckles thickened from years of kneading. His forearms carry small scars from a lifetime of brushing the oven walls at moments of carelessness, the pale marks of burns healed over and forgotten. He moves slowly, but without wasted motion, the way people move when they have performed the same actions so many times that the body conducts itself. He puts the kettle over the fire, not for tea. Tea is centuries away, but for a thin grain porridge, hot water poured over soaked oats, the same thing he eats most mornings. He stands eating it from a wooden bowl while the oven builds its heat, staring at nothing in particular, the candle flame making soft shadows move on the bakehouse wall. This is a thing that is rarely noted about the bakers of the medieval world, the amount of standing and waiting their work required. The oven demanded patience. You could not rush it. You could not negotiate with it. You simply had to give it time and tend it carefully, the way you tend any living thing, and trust that it would arrive at the temperature you needed. Thomas has been trusting the oven for 30 years. He sets down his empty bowl and goes to the flour. The flour bin is a large wooden chest against the wall, iron-hinged and close-fitted to keep out the mice. Thomas lifts the lid and leans in, and even in the dim light of the bakehouse, you can see him visibly settle, a small inward breath, a slight relaxation of the shoulders. The smell of flour is, to a baker, what a hearth fire is to a traveller coming in from the cold. It is safety. It is the beginning of things. Medieval flour was not white. This bears saying clearly, because the image we carry of bread, pale, even, soft, is a modern invention. The flour that fills Thomas's bin is ground from wheat at the mill on the edge of town, a stone-ground flour that retains the bran and the germ and carries a warmth of colour, a faint earthiness of smell, a texture that is frankly coarser than anything we would recognise from a supermarket shelf today. The whitest flour Thomas can obtain is produced by bolting, passing the grain through a series of fine cloth sieves to remove progressively more of the bran. And even this, The finest grade is what we might charitably describe as cream-coloured. There are, in Thomas's bakehouse, at least 4 grades of flour in active use. The finest, called wastel or simnel quality, goes into the white or near-white loaves that the wealthier households in Wickham prefer. These are expensive. The fine sieving wastes a great deal of grain to produce a small amount of bright flour. A merchant's wife might buy these. The priest certainly does. Thomas himself rarely eats them.
The mid-grade wheat flour, still reasonably fine, produces the standard wheaten loaf, the everyday bread of tradespeople and comfortable craftsmen. It is good bread, filling bread, the kind of bread that a man will eat 4 or 5 times a day, because bread, in this century, is both food and eating vessel, both meal and plate. Then there is the household bread, maslin, made from a mixture of wheat and rye, ground together. The rye gives it a darker colour, a denser crumb, a slightly sour edge that intensifies as the loaf ages. This is the bread of the majority, of the farm worker who comes in dusty from the field, of the tanner's apprentice, of Agnes, Thomas's wife, and the children, most mornings. And then at the bottom of the hierarchy, made from rye or barley or bean flour, or some combination of all 3, there is the black bread, dense and dark and slightly bitter, the bread of the very poor, the bread of people who are eating to stay alive and not asking much more of their bread than that. Thomas makes this too, in smaller quantities, sold cheaply. There is no shame in it. Everyone has their season. The water comes from a clay jug filled yesterday at the town well. Thomas pours it in slowly, watching the flour absorb it, feeling the temperature of the mixture against his wrist. A baker's thermometer, passed down from master to apprentice through uncountable generations. Too warm, and the yeast will exhaust itself before the bread has risen properly. Too cold, and it will barely move at all. The yeast itself is something wonderful. Thomas keeps it as a small portion of yesterday's dough, a reserved piece, saved back deliberately before the baking, kept moist and cool in a covered bowl. This is called balm, or sometimes leaven, and it is as old as recorded history. The Egyptians kept it. The Greeks kept it. Every baker in Europe keeps it, in one form or another. This living thing, this invisible community of tiny organisms that makes bread rise and gives it flavour and makes it something more than a paste of flour and water. Thomas does not know what yeast is, biologically. No one does yet. He knows it as a thing that lives, that must be fed, that dies in too much heat or too much cold, that produces something he can only describe as warmth and life in the dough. He treats it with respect. He has always treated it with respect. Bakers who lose their leaven to a cold snap, to a bad batch, to carelessness, face days of flat, disappointing bread while the culture is rebuilt. Thomas has not lost his leaven in 11 years. He considers this one of the private achievements of his life. Salt goes in last, just enough, and then the kneading begins. If there is a sound that defines a bakehouse in the deep hours of the morning, it is the sound of kneading. It is rhythmic and heavy, a pushing, folding sound, punctuated by the soft slap of dough being turned on the board. Thomas kneads the way he does everything else in the bakehouse, without apparent hurry, with enormous sustained force. The muscles of his forearms and shoulders carry 30 years of this particular work, and watching him is like watching something perfectly calibrated. The heel of his hand drives forward. The dough folds. His weight shifts. The cycle repeats. Medieval bread required longer kneading than modern bread, because medieval flour had lower gluten development. The protein structures that give bread its elastic texture needed coaxing with time and physical effort. Where a modern baker, with improved flour, might need 8 or 10 minutes, Thomas kneads for 20, sometimes 25. It is not a hardship, exactly. It is simply work. The kind of work that empties the mind pleasantly and lets the hours pass without friction. When the dough is smooth, when it has transformed from a shaggy, reluctant mass into something silky and elastic, something that springs back when you press it, Thomas covers it with a damp cloth and sets it to rise beside the oven. This will take time. In cold weather, considerably more time. He has learned to judge the dough's readiness not by any clock, but by touch and sight. The gentle dome of a well-risen loaf, the slight give under a careful finger, the smell that shifts subtly from raw flour to something yeasty and warm and alive. While he waits, he mixes the next batch. On a busy morning, which is most mornings, Thomas will have 3 or 4 batches of dough in various stages of completion. One already divided and proving, one still rising, one being shaped, one in the oven. He moves between them in a patient rotation, the bakehouse becoming, in those hours, a kind of quiet choreography. Shaping the loaves is a thing of considerable skill. The size of Warg's falling seed flax head makes his hands round and hollow. The strength and softness of the dough combine in single movements, single rolls. The shape of a loaf was not arbitrary. Different shapes served different purposes, different markets, different meanings. The round cob, a simple, dense sphere, was the most common and the most ancient, the shape a child would make if you gave them dough and asked them to make bread. But Thomas also makes the long, oval loaves that keep well. He makes small rolls, manchets, for households that want something finer. He makes the trencher loaves, flat, dense, only lightly baked, designed not to be eaten, but to serve as edible plates at wealthy tables, soaking up the juices of whatever food is placed on top of them, and then given at the meal's end to servants or the poor at the door. He has a particular mark he stamps into each loaf before baking, a simple T made with a short iron implement. This is required by law. Every baker in England must mark their bread, so that if a loaf is found underweight or underbaked, the baker responsible can be identified. Thomas stamps each loaf with the same deliberate press, the T sinking into the soft dough, the mark that ties every one of these small objects to the man who made it. He is responsible for them all. It comes over the church tower first. then down across the thatch of the better houses on the high street, then along the market street, where the stalls will be erected later in the morning. The fishmonger, the egg woman, the man who sells leather belts, and finally into the cramped alley where Thomas's bakehouse sits, where the new light makes the smoke from the bakehouse chimney silver rather than grey. The town begins to wake in stages, not all at once. A dog barks somewhere. A shutter opens. The sound of someone drawing water. Children's voices, thin and high in the cold morning air. Then the slow accumulating noise of a town coming to life. The creak of cartwheels, the sound of hooves on the cobbled stretch near the market cross. Voices calling across the street in the easy shorthand of neighbours who have known each other all their lives. Thomas hears all of this through the bakehouse wall. It is the clock by which he measures his morning. When the voices start, the first batch must be ready. The first loaves out of the oven are extraordinary. Hot bread is a different thing from cooled bread. Anyone who has stood at a baker's counter and received a loaf still warm from the oven knows this as a physical truth that bypasses all thought. The crust of Thomas's loaves crackles slightly as the steam inside them escapes through small fissures in the baked exterior. The crumb, the interior of the loaf, is dense and chewy, but genuinely yielding, not the brick-like texture we sometimes imagine medieval bread to have been. Properly made, properly leavened, properly baked bread is good bread in any century. Thomas lines the loaves up on the wooden shelf beside the low counter. He does not rush. He moves each one with a certain care, the particular care of a craftsman for the thing he has made, the relationship between maker and made object that is one of the oldest and most quietly satisfying of all human experiences. Agnes appears in the doorway that connects the bakehouse to the small house behind it. She is dressed and awake, her dark hair covered with a linen coif, carrying the baby on her hip with the efficient one-armed carry of someone who has done this with 3 previous children. She looks at the loaves and makes a brief noise of approval. "Good colour," she says. "Good colour," he agrees. This is, between them, high praise. Agnes takes over the counter while Thomas returns to the oven. She knows the business as well as he does, in many ways better. She knows which customers have credit, which ones pay promptly, which ones are likely to argue over weight. She knows the going price of wheat from the miller's gossip. She knows that the priest likes his manchets slightly underbaked and has been told so twice and ignores it. She is, in the language of the time, the baker's wife, which means she is also the baker's business partner, accountant, front-of-house manager, and co-owner of everything. A fact the law of the time recognises only obliquely, but which is completely obvious to anyone watching the bakehouse for a morning. There is something pressing on Thomas this morning that we should understand. The assize of bread. In the year 1266, the English crown enacted a law that regulated the price and weight of bread across the kingdom. Called the assize of bread and ale, It was one of the earliest examples in Western history of systematic consumer protection legislation, and it made Thomas's profession one of the most regulated in the medieval world. The assize worked like this. The local authorities, in Wickham's case the market court that sat in the Guildhall on the High Street, regularly checked the current price of wheat and then calculated what a baker could legally charge for a loaf of a given weight and quality. The formula was strict. The baker was allowed a specific profit margin, enough to cover his materials, his firewood, his assistants, and a modest living, but no more. If the price of wheat rose, the loaf price rose accordingly. If wheat fell, the price of bread had to fall. The market could not be gained. And if a baker was caught selling underweight bread, the offending loaf was tied around the baker's neck, and he was dragged on a hurdle, a kind of flat sled, through the streets of the town. The public nature of the punishment was entirely deliberate. The baker's reputation, which was his livelihood, was the thing being destroyed. A baker known to have been hurdle-dragged faced a ruinous loss of trust. Customers would go elsewhere. The bakehouse would fail. Thomas thinks about this sometimes when he's weighing the loaves in the morning. Not with fear, exactly. He is an honest man, and has always been an honest man, trained to honesty by old Robert, who told him once with great clarity, "The people of this town trust you with the thing they cannot live without. Don't be a fool." But the awareness of it sits quietly in the back of every morning, a light pressure, a reminder that the work he does exists within a web of obligations and scrutiny that is more formal and more serious than most people understand. The assize, for all its severity, was also protective. It kept bread affordable. In a world where a poor family might spend half or more of its income on bread alone, the ability to know, legally, officially, that the loaf you were buying was the weight it was supposed to be, at the price it was supposed to be, was not a trivial thing. It was survival arithmetic. The assize was, in its way, the town's promise to its poorest members. We will not let the bakers exploit you. Thomas keeps his weights on a shelf above the counter, hung on a simple wooden bar. Iron discs of various sizes, used to calibrate the balance scale before Agnes serves the morning customers. Every few weeks, a representative of the market court comes to check them against the official weights kept at the Guildhall. Thomas has never failed this check. He has never come close to failing it. He is not, he would say, a particularly virtuous man, but he is a reliable one. And in his profession, at this particular moment in history, reliability is perhaps the deeper virtue. By the middle of the morning, the bakehouse counter has seen everyone. The merchant's servant came first, early, before the rush, purchasing a dozen manchet rolls and 2 fine wastel loaves for the merchant's household. She paid in coin, counted out precisely, and left without much conversation. She comes every day. Agnes knows her order before she opens her mouth. Then the farm workers, drifting in from the fields on the edge of town. Big, quiet men who buy the maslin loaves, the darker mixed grain bread. Sometimes 2 or 3 at a time, because their work is heavy and they eat accordingly. They pay partly in coin and partly on credit against the harvest. an arrangement that Thomas maintains in a careful set of tallies, notched on sticks, hung inside the bakehouse door. Each customer's stick, each notch a loaf, settled at Michaelmas, when the autumn accounting happens.
A woman comes with her own dough, wrapped in cloth, asking Thomas to bake it. This is common. She has mixed it at home, a household loaf, probably maslin, from her own grain store, and is paying for the use of the oven. Thomas takes it with a nod, marks it with her household mark, using a short wooden stamp she hands him, and slides it in with the current batch. 2 hours later, she will come back for it. The arrangement is as old as the oven itself. A boy comes in, 9, perhaps 10 years old, sent by his mother, carrying a small clay pot in both hands. He sets it on the counter with elaborate care and asks Agnes if Thomas can bake the beans. This is the other great service of the bakehouse oven. After the bread is done and the main heat has passed, the oven is still warm. Not baking warm, but the long, slow, declining warmth of a massive stone structure, releasing its stored heat over the course of hours. Into this declining warmth, the households of Wickham send their pots and their pies and their puddings. The beans will cook slowly in that gentle, fading heat, emerging later in the afternoon, thick and sweet, and ready for the family supper. The boy is given a manchette roll, the small end one, which Agnes always keeps back for the children who come with their mother's pots. He looks at it with wide, absolute pleasure. The pleasure of a child given something unexpectedly good. He says, "Thank you," in a small voice, and then takes an enormous bite before he has even reached the door. Thomas, watching from across the bakehouse, smiles at this. He has 4 children of his own, grown or growing. He remembers exactly that feeling. The specific, total happiness of hot, fresh bread in a child's hands. Some things don't change. Some things across 800 years and every kind of difference remain recognizably the same. He turns back to the oven. After the midday rush, the bakehouse settles into a different rhythm. The morning's main baking is done. The oven is entering its long decline. The banked warmth still useful for the slow cooking of the beans and pots that have been arriving all morning. Thomas sweeps the bakehouse floor. It needs sweeping constantly, the flour dust and ash combining into a pale grey film on the flagstones. And then sits for a while on the low stool near the oven door, the warmth on his face, letting himself be still. He does not sleep. He rarely sleeps in the afternoon, despite the early rising. There is too much still to do. Dough to prepare for tomorrow morning, fuel to restock, a conversation with the miller's boy who comes on Wednesdays to settle accounts. And there is always something breaking. A shelf bracket that has loosened, a bread peel with a cracked handle that needs binding, the latch on the flour bin that sticks. A bakehouse, like any working building, is in constant low-level need of maintenance. Thomas is not a carpenter, but he is handy enough to manage most things, and he prefers to fix them himself rather than spend money on a craftsman for small jobs. His apprentice, Will, arrives in the early afternoon. Will is 14, the son of a tanner from the southern part of town, placed with Thomas 3 years ago in a formal apprenticeship that will last 7 years in total. He is a good boy, not quick to understand things, but steady and willing, which Thomas has come to value more than cleverness. He has the baker's disposition, patient, physically capable, comfortable with repetition. He will be a good baker. Thomas tells him this occasionally, in a restrained way, because he believes a boy should know where he stands, but shouldn't be made vain by excessive praise. The afternoon dough is for tomorrow morning. This is the continuous loop at the centre of a baker's existence. Today's morning is tomorrow's preparation. The bread you are eating tonight was made from dough mixed last evening. The bread you will eat tomorrow morning is sitting covered in a bowl right now, slowly rising, slowly becoming the thing it will be. Time in a bakehouse is always layered, always circular. There is no clear division between one day's work and the next. Thomas watches Will mix, watches his hands, the angle of his wrist, the way he incorporates the water, and says nothing yet. Will's kneading technique has improved considerably in the past year. The forearm strength built up, the motion smoother. There was a period in his first year where he overworked the dough, driving it past elastic into something tight and resistant, and the loaves came out dense and poorly shaped. Thomas corrected this in his way, not with a scolding, but by standing beside the boy and kneading a portion himself, slowly, so Will could see exactly where the motion changed, exactly where the dough signalled that it was done. You learn a bakehouse by feeling, Thomas told him, not by being told. This is the wisdom he received from old Robert. This is the wisdom he passes on. There is a moment in the late afternoon when the customers have stopped coming and Will has gone home and Agnes is putting the children to bed in the house behind. When Thomas is alone in the bakehouse with the cooling oven and the smell of the day's bread still hanging in the warm air. When the whole accumulated life of the place seems to settle quietly around him. He has swept the floor again. The last pots were collected an hour ago, their owners thanking him briefly in that matter-of-fact way that people thank a service they have depended on for so long it has become invisible. The dough for tomorrow is mixed and resting. The oven's fire needs banking for the night, a careful arrangement of the remaining coals that will keep heat slowly alive through the dark hours, enough that tomorrow morning's first edition of fuel will catch quickly and build to temperature before 3 o'clock. He does this task with the same quiet attention he gives everything in the bakehouse. The poker moves methodically, gathering the coals into a mound at the oven's centre, preserving the deep heat. He adds a few larger pieces of wood, not to burn brightly, but to smoulder slowly, sustaining the warmth without consuming it. Then he closes the oven door, and the roar of the fire is replaced by the deep, contained murmur of stored heat. If you could stand in this bakehouse for a long time, long enough to see beyond Thomas's years, back through the generations of bakers before him, you would find that the building itself carries an extraordinary continuity. The oven was built perhaps 60 years ago by a craftsman whose name no one now remembers, a specialist in kiln and furnace construction who understood how to hold heat in stone.
Before this oven, there was an earlier one, less sophisticated, in the same spot. Before that, a simple clay-lined pit. The ground this bakehouse stands on has been warm since before anyone living can remember. It has been warm through plague years, through drought years, through the flood of 1256 that took 3 houses on the far side of the market. The warmth is older than any living person's memory of the town. The bread comes from a warmth that predates all of them. Thomas is not, himself, a reflective man in the literary sense. He does not sit and compose thoughts about continuity and time. But he has a craftsman's relationship with his materials and tools that contains something like this. The oven is not just a piece of equipment. It is the thing that makes him what he is. Without it, he is just a man with flour on his hands. With it, he is a baker. He is someone the town needs. He is someone whose absence would be felt immediately and practically by every household in Wickham from the moment it opened its door in the morning.
This is not pride, exactly. It is something steadier than pride. Something that comes from knowing your place in the order of things. Really knowing it, in your hands and your back, and the daily rhythm of your rising, and finding that place good. He stands for a moment, with his hand resting on the warm face of the oven. Then he goes to check the dough one last time. The night comes gently to Wickham. The market street empties in the easy way of a town that has finished its business for the day and sees no reason to stay out in the October cold. Windows glow amber and gold from tallow light within. Smoke rises from chimneys in the still air, going straight up before curling slowly at the top, the way smoke rises in the absence of any wind. A cat crosses the empty street. The church bell rings compline, the last canonical hour, the close of the official day. And in the houses of Wickham, people pull their blankets around them and let the day go.
Thomas eats supper with Agnes and the children at the small table in the back of the house. It is simple food, a pottage of dried peas and root vegetables, cooked over the hearth, ladled into wooden bowls. Bread, naturally, their own maslin loaf, torn into pieces and used to scoop up the thick broth. A small piece of hard cheese. The baby, in her crib, sleeps. The older children are tired and eat without much talk. Agnes is tired too, and Thomas is tired, in the deep muscle way of a man who has been on his feet since 2 a.m, and lifted and carried and kneaded and swept the long, slow hours of a working day. After the children are in bed, and Agnes has banked the hearth fire and said her evening prayers in the brief, private way she always does, kneeling for just a few moments by the bed, her lips barely moving, Thomas makes one last visit to the bakehouse. He does this every night, without exception.
He carries the candle through the low doorway and stands for a moment in the dark, feeling the residual warmth, smelling the bread smell that never entirely leaves the building. He checks the covered bowls of dough, still rising, right temperature, good. He checks the oven door, closed properly, drawing correctly. He checks the flour bin, the salt box, the jug of water he will need in the morning. He checks the supply of kindling near the oven, adding a few more pieces from the stack outside the back door, because tomorrow will be cold, and a cold morning needs more fuel to start. All is well. He stands for a moment longer than necessary, the candle in his hand, the oven warm before him.
In a few hours, 3 hours perhaps, 4,
he will be standing in this exact spot again, the candle in the same hand, the darkness the same darkness, beginning the same sequence of tasks he will perform tomorrow as he performed today and has performed for 30 years. The dough will be the same dough. The oven will be the same oven. The town will wake in the same way, wanting the same thing, and he will have it ready. This is a life that looks from the outside very small, but standing inside it, inside the warmth of the bakehouse, inside the quiet satisfaction of a day's work done and a night's preparation made, and a whole sleeping town fed, it does not feel small. It feels like what a life is supposed to feel like: necessary, contained, sufficient. The warmth of the oven at your back, and the bread smell in the air, and the knowledge that tomorrow, as today,
He blows out the candle. He goes to bed. Somewhere above the town, the stars come out over Wickham, cold and bright, and entirely indifferent to the small, warm light that has just been extinguished in the bakehouse on the alley. The oven holds its heat through the dark. The dough rises slowly in the covered bowls. The street is empty and quiet and very cold. And in a few hours, before anything else moves, before the sky shows even the earliest grey, a door will open. A single candle flame will appear. And the baker will begin again.